Hello art lovers, welcome to my painting channel. I'm Pete Bain, and in this video I'll demonstrate how I painted this scene of an old barn in the autumn. I love the warm color scheme in this piece, the reds, the ochres, the yellows. I love how full of light it is. Now, there are a lot of components to this painting: the tree, the canopy, various sections of the barn, the path, the foreground. It was a bit of work trying to bring it all together, and I'm looking forward to sharing that process with you. So let's get started straight away with the demonstration. Before we begin painting, let's take a quick look at the reference image. This is a photo I took in early November of Clark Farm in Carlisle, Massachusetts. All right, well, I began this painting by toning the canvas with alizarin crimson. I thin the paint with a solvent and apply it with a paper towel for speed and also to save my brushes for the actual painting. The solvent I use is called Gamsol from the Gamblin Company. It's an odorless and highly refined solvent, so there are no harmful aromatics to worry about. I'm painting on a hardboard panel that I cut to 14 by 11 inches, and I then glued a canvas sheet onto that. My drawing starts with the spacing of the barn itself within the canvas. I determined the location of the left edge, and then the location of the roof and foundation lines followed. At that point, it was easy to draw the horizon line and then locate the maple tree within the side of the barn, which was just left of the center of the barn. This barn is part of Clark Farm in Carlisle, Mass. The farm has a beautiful old farmhouse and a massive barn and a number of interesting old outbuildings on 50 or 60 acres of fields. It was a dairy farm from 1899 until the mid 80s, and today they have a market and a CSA program. It's a really nice part of the community. That actually the whole area is pretty special. It's wonderful for a drive in the fall. A couple of quick tips on drawing a tree. When you draw a tree, you want to start with the trunk and pay close attention to the growth pattern of the limbs. Accuracy here is important to make the tree believable. Usually you want any change in the direction of the limbs to be angular rather than smooth curves. And when the limb does change direction, it always gets more narrow. As I'm sure you've noticed, this image has a lot of elements to it. The barn, the roof, the tree, all the limbs, the foliage, the canopy, the foreground, the distant trees, etc., etc. So, given that, I thought it would be a good idea to plot the value scheme of the painting by doing a monochromatic underpainting. I don't always do that, especially on simpler pieces, but this one I felt warranted that effort, and it's a great idea because it just really gives you a roadmap as to how to go forward once you start blocking in with color in the next step. So at this point, that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm painting everything in tones of black and white and gray, mapping the skeletal structure of the painting. And this work is going to make the subsequent layers of paint go down much more accurately. Once I was happy with the value pattern, the black and white image, I was ready to lay in the colors, ready to begin the block-in. Normally, I begin by painting the most distant objects first and then paint passages as they get nearer to the viewer, ending with the foreground. But in this case, I started with the side of the barn because that is my center of interest, and also because I was feeling kind of lazy. I find painting a lacy canopy of foliage and sky a bit tedious, so I decided to leave it for later. But really, I was most interested in this part of the painting, and I wanted to nail down accurate color and value on the side of the barn, both the sunlit side and that shadowed side. A couple of notes as I paint in this the side of the barn here. On the shadow, I noticed that there was a gradation of value. So it was a much deeper, darker shadow in the corners. And then as we approached the edge of light, it became much lighter in value. So that helps to add some realism to that and feeling and depth to that part of the painting. And also there was a beautiful cast shadow from the foliage on the left side of the barn. So I wanted to try to nail that. I didn't want to overdo it, but I definitely wanted to have it as an element. I thought it added a nice bit of interest there. So I spent some time getting both of those aspects of the barn correct. Adding the trim, the white trim along the edges of the barn and the eaves and the windows really helps finish off the that element of the painting. And it's white. The trim is white in reality, but in shadow it looks a lot more violet. So that's what I painted it as. I mixed up alizarin crimson with ultramarine blue and had a nice violet color for the trim in the shadowed areas. And in the light areas, I just used white with a tiny drop of cadmium yellow. Okay, next I painted the background, followed by the foreground. And I deliberately made the background set of trees lighter and cooler than what I was seeing in my reference photo and reference painting. I wanted them to recede in space. Shadows can be blue and purple. The foliage is ochres and olives, somewhat washed out and desaturated. And when I got to the foreground, I tried to make it rich and deep in color to reflect this carpet of yellow leaves that are warm and vibrant. I didn't use any white paint or blue paint in the foreground. Uh, Primarily, I used cad yellow pale with some cad red and transparent red oxide to paint those leaves on the ground in the foreground. Well, I can't put it off any longer. I've got to tackle that tree and the sky holes and the foliage. So I began by reestablishing the dark limbs, ensuring that they are clear, distinct, they look natural, they're not too symmetrical. Um, I also began to paint the light side where the light was hitting the limbs to give them some form. They are truly cylinders, so I was trying to get that effect as well. I like to start with the sky and overpaint those areas a little bit. I paint the sky bits larger than they actually are, and then I paint the darker foliage bits covering the extra sky where necessary. When painting wet into wet, it can be difficult to get a lighter value to cover a darker one, and that's why I like to paint the sky first. But this ultimately becomes a back and forth battle. Paint in some more sky, paint in some more foliage until I'm satisfied with the results. When I painted in the foliage, I began with the darker shadowed masses, trying to approximate the shapes from my reference photo. I mixed a darkish olive green color, which was Viridian with transparent red oxide. You can also mix in some ultramarine blue or yellow ochre pale to give some variety in the tones there. And then I had to go back and add in more sky because I had laid in the foliage a bit too heavily. Now I turn my attention to the roof, which is another element of the painting that I had somewhat overlooked. Uh, and the reason for that was because the roof was sort of a reddish asphalt shingle roof, which I didn't find very attractive. And I knew I wanted to change it, but I didn't know which direction I wanted to go. But I ultimately decided that when in doubt, soft grays and violets usually are a good choice. Here I take a take stock of my tree and make some minor modifications to its limbs. I'm removing some, adding others before I embark on another round of the foliage and another round of the sky. And I'm getting closer and really approaching the point where I can think about adding those bright yellow leaves on top of all of those darks to give this wonderful canopy effect, this umbrella effect over the whole scene. Before I began with that bright sunlit yellow foliage, I did notice that the mass of trees in the background was much too close in value to the value of the canopy foliage above the maple tree. So I took some of my sky color, white with ultramarine blue, and I painted directly into that wet paint of those background trees and softened the value on their tops. The goal was to both show that they're more distant to, from the viewer than the canopy is, and also to sort of round the tops, to turn them over, to make them a three-dimensional shape. These leaves were a mixture of cadmium yellow light with yellow ochre and some cad red. I was painting wet into wet, so I was getting a bit more blending than I wanted, which resulted in having to go back and redo some of the darker shadowed areas of the foliage. So in hindsight, if I had let the paint set up for a little longer, this may have been easier. Also, I was trying to avoid an even symmetrical pattern with the foliage, not only in the distribution of leaves, but also in their value. There's something in our nature that makes us want to paint perfectly spaced polka dots, and we need to resist that tendency to use nature as our guide and to look for and depict those asymmetrical patterns that we find there. The following day, I returned to the painting with fresh eyes and decided I wanted to brighten up the path in the foreground of fallen leaves. That was the major change uh, that I felt needed to be done. And then I fussed around with some of the details of the painting. I tightened up the tree limbs as they spread away from the trunk. I thought that that was a little dark and confusing, so I cleaned up that area. I also brightened up the sunlit sections of the white trim. I couldn't help myself, and I did one more pass of sky and foliage painting. I also used the palette knife to suggest some very thin twigs within the canopy. I darkened the shadow underneath the trim. I suggested a fieldstone foundation with some rounded gray brush strokes at the base of the barn. And finally, I added a little detail within the windows. So here's the finished painting. My hope is that when people see it, they feel that crisp autumn air in New England and are excited by that beautiful slanting light illuminating all those fall colors. And I also really hope that you enjoyed this demonstration and took away some tips and are inspired to make your own art. Take care and keep an eye out for more demonstrations from me. Bye for now.